this is Mike, letusreason.com. This is going to be part 2 of our series on Nimrod. The first video covered all the necessary background information that we're going to need to now move into discussing the identity of Nimrod himself. So if you haven't first watched that video, I would just recommend that you go back, you watch that one first before coming back to this one. It just gives you all the groundwork. It lays the foundation that really is needed to appreciate what we're going to discuss now. But I do want to give a quick review as we go into this video, since there was a lot of information that we discussed. We began by looking at what the Bible says about Nimrod in the relevant passages. And we then spend time identifying the cities that he was said to have built after the flood in early Mesopotamia. And we really tried to understand this Sumerian period of deep antiquity. We explored some of the historical and archaeological information that, like I said, is going to be foundational for now moving forward and actually identifying Nimrod. So let's start our review by looking at the passage in Genesis 10 that gives us most of what we know biblically about Nimrod. Genesis 10, 8-12, and it says this: Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Now, we learned 6 very key points about Nimrod from this passage. The first is that Nimrod is a son of Cush, a grandson of Ham, and a great-grandson of Noah. The second is that Nimrod was known as being a mighty hunter, and the Hebrew actually implies against the Lord. And so then number 3, Nimrod was in opposition to the Lord. Number 4, Nimrod's kingdom began in the land of Shinar, which is Hebrew for Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Number 5, the home base of his kingdom in Sumer were the cities Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. And number 6, Nimrod then expanded his empire northwest and founded Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin. Now, one of the most important things that we explored was the critical foundational decision of what version of biblical chronology we decide to follow before then attempting to identify Nimrod historically. And since the genealogies given in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Christian Old Testament used at the time of Jesus, amount to an almost 1,500-year difference from the genealogies in the Masoretic text, which is the Old Testament found in our English Bibles today, then it's critical to first determine which is more valid, because we're going to be looking in completely different millennia for the historical Nimrod. Only one can be correct, obviously. And we pointed out that the Septuagint actually matches up quite well with the accepted understanding of secular history and archaeology, while the dates given in the Masoretic are just way off. The Septuagint places the events of the flood and the Tower of Babel, and of course Nimrod's life, in the 3000s BC, which is a time known as the Uruk period. And this makes total sense, since history and archaeology then shows the emergence of the great civilizations of antiquity within the next several hundred years, such as dynastic Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and then soon after China. The invention of writing also takes place at this time, whereas you can see on this chart how utterly ridiculous the Masoretic chronology looks against the backdrop of what history and archaeology tell us. Now, I said this in that video, and I'm going to say it again now. It's not to say that history is perfect. Even historians admit that there's some wiggle room, but it's quite well attested, and we're not talking about a 1,000-year difference as the Masoretic would require. We then sought to identify the cities that are mentioned as being part of Nimrod's kingdom. We identified Erech as the Sumerian city of Uruk, Akkad as the well-known but yet undiscovered city of Akkad, Calneh as yet undiscovered. Nineveh, of course, is well known, located near modern-day Mosul, Iraq. Calah as the city of Calhu, which is located nearby Nineveh. Rehoboth-ir and Rezin as yet undiscovered. And then Babel as Eridu, the location of the Tower of Babel incident that seems to have been instigated by Nimrod. We pointed out that since the Babylon that we normally think of from later stories in Daniel, for example, was not even built at the time Nimrod lived, then it's very clear that that Babylon cannot be thought of as the Babel of Genesis 10 and 11. It wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. And we then showed a number of points of evidence matching Babel with Eridu. And if you want to know what they are, you can go back to the previous video. I believe it's around the 40-minute mark. Well, I hope that review brought you back to where we left off. So then who was Nimrod? Well, I'm not going to tease you with this any longer. I believe that by far the best candidate for the historical Nimrod is the ancient Sumerian hero and priest king of Uruk named Enmerkar, who's thought to have lived at the end of the 4th or the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. Again, at the exact time Nimrod would have lived, according to Septuagint dating. Enmerkar is one of the most important figures in the surviving Sumerian epics, and he appears in several of these epic tales, as well as being mentioned in the Sumerian king list and other places. An epic poem preserved on a clay tablet from around 2000 BC entitled Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada refers back to the earlier time period of Nimrod, according to Septuagint dating, and when you compare it with what we're told in early Genesis, it seems to remarkably portray Nimrod as this early Sumerian king Enmerkar rebuilding southern Mesopotamia after the flood, and his attempt to build the Tower of Babel in an effort to reestablish a system of pagan worship and prevent another flood from destroying their civilization. It shows him as the king of Eridu and Uruk, constructing temples and ziggurats in those cities, especially a massive ziggurat in Eridu, or Babel, and communicating with the king of the northern land of Arada, or in Assyrian, the land of Urartu, or biblical Ararat, where Noah and his family found themselves after the flood, probably eastern Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. In that story, Enmerkar tries to pressure the king of Arada to supply him goods to build this giant ziggurat in Eridu, part of the sacred complex that included the Abzu temple of Enki, the one that we discussed in the previous video that was excavated in Eridu, which we and others have suggested is the location of the Tower of Babel. Now, in the previous video, we spent a lot of time identifying these cities and trying to understand the context of those cities, the geography, the backdrop of ancient Sumer, the cities that the Bible says Nimrod built and was king over. So I hope if you watched it, you can now appreciate the value of that introduction, and it was really why I needed to make this presentation into 2 separate videos, and there's going to be more to come. When we know that backdrop and we know the biblical account, and then start to see these ancient Sumerian epics like Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, it makes it very easy to then put together and recognize that Enmerkar is the character that history records doing the same things as the Bible says Nimrod did, in the same geographical location, at the same exact time period in history, if you use Septuagint dating. The tradition of Enmerkar as the founder and first king of Uruk seems to date to at least the Jemdet-Nazar period. This is around 3100 to 2900 BC, which directly followed the Uruk period, during the actual time that we believe Nimrod lived, as found in an ancient tablet called the ADGI-4 list, first found in Uruk. Now, this is a cuneiform word list of animals, numbers, words, and agricultural terminology. And these word lists are basically a series of ancient Mesopotamian glossaries that preserve the meanings of cuneiform symbols and how to pronounce them in their Akkadian and other language equivalents. They're the oldest literary texts from Mesopotamia. And wherever cuneiform tablets have been uncovered, these kind of lists have also been found. So what this means is the tradition of Enmerkar as being the founder of Uruk literally goes back to the time that he was alive, the time of Nimrod, which began during the Uruk period and carries over into the Jemdet-Nazar period that followed, as this change from one period to another seems to have been fueled by the Tower of Babel incident itself. I'd like to show you an actual quote from the ADGI-4 list. It mentions Enmerkar and his wife Enmerkarzi as the builders of cities and the bringers of agriculture to southern Mesopotamia. It says this: Enmerkar and his wife Enmerkarzi, who know how to build towns, made brick and brick pavements. When the yearly flood reached its proper level, they made irrigation canals and all kind of irrigation ditches. Now, this sounds incredibly similar to the biblical portrayal of Nimrod going to southern Mesopotamia after the flood and building or rebuilding, whatever the case may be, its principal cities, founding his empire. It's It's also very interesting that according to the translation of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, that was done by Samuel Kramer, who was one of the world's leading Assyriologists and an expert in Sumerian history and language, this epic tale actually preserves a record of the dispersion of languages, incredibly. So let me show you this actual quote. It says this: "The whole universe, the people in unison to Enlil in one tongue spoke. Then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu," speaking about Enki, "changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into the speech of man, that until then had been one." Now, I want you to notice the line that says that everyone to Enlil in one tongue spoke. This suggests that at one time, mankind not only spoke in one language, but followed one God as well. So, in other words, people did not go from many gods to one, but from one God to many. Then it credits the god Enki with dispersing the languages, which had until then been one. And further, Enmerkar is also credited in Sumerian legend as being the inventor of writing, and it's linked to what we would consider the Tower of Babel. Quote from Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada describes the messages that Enmerkar was sending through a messenger back to the king of Arada. And at some point, the message became too much for the messenger to remember or to deliver effectively, and so Enmerkar put the words on a clay tablet for the first time. The quote calls Enmerkar the Lord of Kulab, Kulab referring to the temple district in Uruk, with temples to the god Anu and to the goddess Inanna. Now, Inanna you might recognize as Ishtar, or Ashtoreth, the queen of heaven that we find mentioned in the Bible. And it relates to this pagan system that Nimrod had helped to reinstitute and mainstream, the system that would be dispersed with the different people groups after the languages get scrambled at Babel. And it says this: "Because the messenger's mouth was too heavy and he could not repeat it, the Lord of Kulab," referring to Enmerkar, king of Uruk, "patted some clay and put the words on it as on a tablet. Before that day, there had been no putting words on clay." And so I think that's very interesting. Now, Enmerkar is also recorded as being a historical king in what's known as the Sumerian King List. It's written in Sumerian on clay tablets. And this is a document that lists a succession of cities in Sumer and its neighboring regions, and it lists their rulers and the lengths of their reigns. Several versions of the Sumerian King List have survived, each one being a little bit different. But in its best known and well preserved version, as recorded on what's called the Weld Blundell Prism, the list begins with a number of antediluvian kings who ruled before a great flood swept over the land. And of course, this would seem to refer to the flood of Noah in the Bible. And afterwards, the list gives a succession of various city-states and their dynasties of kings. The king list records that 8 kings reigned before a great flood, although other recordings of this list, such as one preserved in Greek by the Babylonian historian Berosus around 200 BC, claims 10 kings instead of 8. And this is interesting because Genesis lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah who lived before the flood. And many have noticed these unmistakable similarities between Genesis and the king list. Now, one of the apparent problems with the list, though, is the ridiculously long reigns of many of the earlier rules, especially the ones said to have ruled before the flood. For example, one king alone is said to have ruled for about 43,000 years, which is obviously not realistic. Of course, we know that the Bible also, while not being nearly as extreme as this, lists the antediluvians, those who lived before the flood, as living for, in some cases, up to almost 1,000 years. So we do see that same pattern. And it's possible that these unrealistic year reigns are somehow being misunderstood or misinterpreted by us today. And it's been noticed by some researchers that they may be multiples of certain numbers and relate to the sexagesimal system, being multiples of 60. So it could be that we're simply ignorant to how they should be understood. But that's a different discussion. Interestingly, though, after the flood, the king list records kings who ruled for much shorter periods of time, exactly as is also found in the Bible. So the Sumerian king list not only documents a great flood early in man's history with 8 or 10 kings or patriarchs before it, but it also reflects the same pattern of decreasing longevity after the flood, same as in the Bible. But let's understand, though, that even beyond the problem of the extremely long reigns of the pre-flood and immediately post-flood kings, there are other problems with the Sumerian king list. And many of the kings listed are historical, but many have not been confirmed elsewhere in archaeology. Some consider the list to include both historical and mythical kings, but it would be strange for the ancient Sumerians to have done this, mixing reality with myth. Of course, it could just be that these kings have not yet been discovered or recognized by archaeological discoveries that would then confirm their historicity. Now, as would be expected, the farther back the list goes in history, the more poorly attested the names become. But starting with the Akkadian rulers, but especially for the Ur-3 and Isin dynasties, the king list actually becomes much more reliable. So, in many ways, the Sumerian king list truly is a mystery. Why would the Sumerians combine mythical rulers with actual historical rulers in one single document? Why are there so many similarities with Genesis? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? These are just some of the questions that still remain unanswered. But this Sumerian king list mentions Enmerkar, and his name is found in the post-flood segment as the founder and king of Uruk, just as the Bible says Nimrod was the post-flood founder and ruler of Erech. According to the king list, in the beginning, kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu, and then passed successively through 5 cities until the flood. After the flood, it says that kingship began in Kish, before being passed to Uruk, which is listed as Iana, which is a reference to the temple of Inanna in Uruk. Enmerkar is listed as the second king of the Iana dynasty, but being the founder of Uruk. Now, here's the apparent problem. The Kish dynasty, listed in between the flood and the Uruk dynasty, lasted way too long to perfectly align Enmerkar with Nimrod. The king list claims that the Kish dynasty included 23 kings who ruled for a ridiculous 23,310 years. Now, obviously, the 23,310 years part is ridiculous, even aside from the Nimrod conversation. But having 23 kings between the flood and Enmerkar, or Nimrod, would fail to align with the listing given in the Bible, where the flood occurs and then Noah's son Ham begets Cush, who begets Nimrod. That's 3 generations, Ham, Cush, Nimrod. So how can 23 kings fit between the flood and Nimrod? Now, I want to make it clear that this alone is not reason to throw out the Enmerkar-Nimrod comparison. It's actually the only thing that doesn't perfectly fit. But we know, and every scholar knows, that the Sumerian king list has its problems and is not to be understood as perfectly historically accurate, especially in the earlier parts, such as the pre-flood kings and the dynasty of Kish. Most, or maybe even all of these kings are not attested in actual history and archaeology, and all of them have ridiculously inflated regnal periods, or periods that they were said to have reigned. Now, one potential reason why these times could be so inflated is that some of these kings have been found to have overlapping reigns of other kings who are also listed, and this inflates the time. Also, many could be ruling contemporaneously in different locations instead of being seen as completely sequential. There's many other potential explanations for this, and certainly not reason to discard all the positive evidence for the Nimrod-Enmerkar comparison. We still have a lot more evidence to discuss. And so it's well known that the earlier segments of the king list are somewhat dubious at times and not really thought to be perfect representations of actual history. But beginning with the Uruk dynasty, which Enmerkar is a part of, everything begins to align much better with the Bible. Even the regnal years are quite perfect for what would be expected. Enmerkar is said to rule for 420 years. And given the ages of the patriarchs, the first several generations after the flood, this would actually align perfectly with what would be expected. The Bible tells us about the contemporaries of Nimrod in the line of Shem and gives us their ages, and they were living well into their 400s. So as we'll see, if we were to delete the entire segment about the Kish dynasty that supposedly took place between the flood and the Uruk dynasty, the Enmerkar-Nimrod equivocation would really be perfect. Now let's take a closer look at what I mean by that. And this is what the king list says about Enmerkar. It says, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Then Kish was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Iana, again referring to the temple complex in Uruk. In Iana, Meskiag-Kashur, son of Utu, became lord and king. He ruled for 324 years. Meskiag-Kashur entered the sea and disappeared. Enmerkar, son of Meskiag-Kashur, the king of Uruk, who built Uruk, became king. He ruled for 420 years. And so there's some confusion about this. The king list shows a king named Meskiag-Kasher, son of Utu and father of Enmerkar, as the first king of Uruk after the kingship passed from Kish to Uruk. And therefore you would think that he would have to be the founder. And yet the list clearly distinguishes Enmerkar as the founder of Uruk. And there's numerous possible explanations for this. We're not going to waste time going down that road here. The text is quite clear in naming Enmerkar as the builder of Uruk after the flood. What's interesting, though, is the seeming connection between Genesis and the king list here. Some people have suggested a correlation between the name Meskiag-Kasher, the father of Enmerkar, and the biblical Cush, who was the father of Nimrod. They suspect that there's a linguistic connection between Gash in Meskiag-Kasher and Cush, making Cush a shortened form of this king's name, Cush or Gash. That would then make his father Utu another name for Noah's son Ham, Nimrod or Enmerkar's grandfather. Egyptologist David Rohl, who's not a Christian by the way, is one of the scholars that connects Enmerkar with Nimrod, and he writes as follows. If in the biblical context Enmerkar is to be equated with Nimrod, then Meskiag-Kasher as Enmerkar's father should be none other than Cush, father of Nimrod. How should we read the name Meskiag-Kasher? Well, this Sumerian name is made up of the word elements mesh, which means hero, ki, which means earth, ag, which means divider, and kasher, the meaning of which is unknown. In other words, we can read this name as Kasher or Cash, the hero who divides the earth. Could this be the Cush of Genesis, who carves himself a new kingdom in Ethiopia, the mountain land of Africa, and divides the earth among his people? It is well known that the biblical character Cush is the ancestor of the lands of Northeast Africa, generally around modern-day countries like Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. And the thought is that Cush and his clan set sail from the Persian Gulf, rounded the Arabian Peninsula, and landed in northeastern Africa. Some, like Rohl, have speculated that this initial migration actually took place prior to the Tower of Babel incident, as sort of a first wave of migration. This emigration by Cush and his clan is potentially the meaning recorded in the king list where Meskiag-Kasher is said to have entered the sea and disappeared. But in some recordings of the king's list, there's an additional part that's added onto that. They say Meskiag-Kasher entered the sea and came out at the mountains. David Rohl argues that this can be understood to say that Meskiag-Kasher, or Cush, journeyed across the sea and came ashore in a mountainous land. Or in other words, that he undertook an expedition by sea, and at the end of which he reached a land dominated by mountains along its shoreline. This would be the eastern shoreline or coastline of Africa in today's Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and the Cushites would form the early kingdom of Cush on the Sudanese Nile Valley. Rohl then continues and says, they themselves claim descent from King Meskiag-Kasher, biblical Cush, of Uruk, who shortly after his death had been deified both in the Nile Valley Kingdom and in Susiana, referring to Susa in Sumer. He, after all, was the hero who had adventured out into the sea and established the first of these African colonies. The author of Genesis knew him as Cush, son of Ham. The Sumerian king list recorded the first antediluvian ruler of Uruk by the eponym Meskiag-Kasher, which translates as Cash, the hero who divided the earth amongst his followers. The later Egyptians also remembered him through the name of their southern neighbor, the kingdom of Cash, which Egyptologists refer to as Cush. So we've discussed a ton of evidence linking Nimrod and Enmerkar. But what about the name? How would the name Enmerkar relate to the name Nimrod? If they're actually the same person, shouldn't there be a connection between the names? Well, the answer is actually incredibly simple. I'm going to go ahead and put up this sort of flow chart to show you how we get there. So first, both names have the same basic consonants, NMR. Then the D gets added in the biblical account as a Hebrew play on words. NMR plus the Hebrew word marad, which means to rebel, becomes Nimrod. And then we have the biblical account consistently emphasizing that Nimrod was also known as a mighty hunter before the Lord, while the kar in Enmerkar is a Sumerian logogram for hunter, meaning Enmerkar would literally mean Enmer the hunter. And so the final result is Nimrod the mighty hunter and Enmerkar or Enmer the hunter. It's the same thing. Now, let me show you this quote from David Rohl, who breaks it down further. The word Kar is the Sumerian logogram for the Akkadian Habilum, which has the meaning hunter. So we should read this name as Enmer the hunter. Ancient Hebrew writing, as with Egyptian hieroglyphs, consisted only of consonants. Thus, we really have Enmar the hunter. This legendary ruler of Uruk is therefore none other than the legendary biblical potentate Nimrod, the mighty hunter and builder of Babel, Erech or Uruk, and Akkad. The final D in the biblical name was not part of the ancient Sumerian spelling, but was added by the writer of the book of Genesis. We find many instances in the Bible of foreign or non-Hebrew names being Hebraized in a way that permits the Israelite reader to fit the person or place into the biblical context. The Genesis author employs this play on words technique to add color and interest to the tale being told. Specialists in biblical exegesis have long realized that Nimrod derives from the Hebrew verb marad, meaning to rebel. This word has been used because the writer of Genesis knew that Nimrod had instigated a rebellion against God, the physical manifestation of which was the building of the Tower of Babel. So any attempt to determine the original name of the king who rebelled against Yahweh has to be worked backwards from this play on words. I have suggested here that the original Sumerian name of the king was Enmer the Hunter, and therefore NMR in its simplest form. Thus, it's a straightforward matter to see the addition of the final D to make NMRD, or Nimrod, in the biblical version as a play on words that characterizes the king as the one who rebels against God. This also fits extremely well with the latest interpretation of the Genesis text, which is now understood to carry the meaning he was a mighty hunter or brigand in opposition to Yahweh rather than before Yahweh. Genesis 10:8. All right, so let's review all the many points of similarity here between what the Bible tells us about Nimrod and what we know about Enmerkar. First, they both lived in the 3000s BC during the Uruk period after the Great Flood. They were both credited with building the earliest cities in Shinar or Sumer after the flood. They were both Sumerian kings credited with building Erech or Uruk. They were both remembered as rebelling against God or introducing pagan worship of false gods. They were both known for massive building projects, the Tower of Babel and the Eridu Ziggurat and Enki temple complex. They both used the same construction technique, baked mud brick with bitumen. Both building sites were abruptly abandoned. They're both either directly credited with or lived contemporaneous with the invention of writing. Both are renowned as being hunters. And finally, the name connection, NMRD the hunter and NMR Carr. Well, I hope you guys find this subject as fascinating as I do, to try to look back into deep antiquity and see that these connections have been hiding there the whole time. You have to wonder why this is not being discussed by more people, although I believe the answer is that they're using the wrong timeline and they're searching in the wrong millennium. That's actually going to be the topic of our next video in this Nimrod series, where we discuss some of the popular candidates put forward by many people, even by scholars, as being Nimrod. And yet, as we'll find, the evidence just doesn't line up, as I think I've shown in this video, that it does with Enmerkar. So I hope you join me on that video. And after that, I have 2 more videos that are going to involve Nimrod and ancient Egypt. You're not going to want to miss those. So thank you guys for watching. God bless you, and I'll see you on the next video.